it's a big world.
My guest today is Professor Sheremeta, who is Associate Professor of Economics at Case Western Reserve University, co-chair of Ukrainian American House, and founding rector of American University of Kyiv. Welcome, Roman.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks for doing this. So I got some of your papers, and as I mentioned to you, we talk a bit about Ukraine in general and the war that's going on there. I'm very ignorant of this area and its history and everything, but my knowledge is not substantially inferior to, I would say, some of the American policymakers and some of the folks who were on the stage in the Republican debate last night. So I don't feel too bad about it. But we want to talk a bit about Ukraine, its historical context, why this war is happening and all of that.
Sure.
But before you get there, I want to put the context. So you have a sort of a special issue. It's entitled Theories of Conflict and War.
That's right.
And you say it aims to bring together different perspectives on conflict and war from different disciplines: economics, psychology, evolutionary biology, anthropology, political science, and management. That's an eclectic mix of disciplines.
Yeah.
And I would imagine I can understand how they would think about conflict and the theory behind it. We will talk about economics in more general later. But if you think about other disciplines here, what are the commonality that you see, how they think about conflict and war?
Yeah, so this was a issue that I edited together with Eric Kimbrough, who is a good friend and co-author of mine, and it was in a very prestigious economic journal. And we put a really cool team of people, really specialists in all their areas, to talk about conflict, war, contests. Now, as it just happened, this is my field of research. I'm a behavioral economist, but I have applied the tools that I have learned specifically to contest, war, conflict, and alike situations. So when we talk across different disciplines, they do look at the conflict and war quite differently. For example, if we talk about psychology, psychologists usually think in terms of conflict as the innate motivation that guide us, to engage in conflict. They sometimes even talk about conflict within yourself, right? So you can have a interior conflict, and that's the way that they approach from the cognitive perspective. When we talk about anthropologists, they study basically from the perspective of the evolutionary biology, right? So why we evolved in the way to be the kind of species that learn how to cooperate over time. But at the beginning, we were really fighting for survival. And so there are a lot of really interesting approaches from anthropologists, mostly from the evolutionary biology perspective. When we talk about political science, they really embrace the conflict and war, how we think it is. It's a geopolitical context, political conflicts, context, and so on and so forth. When we talk about economists, so this is where I am really an expert, we really talk about conflict as resource exhaustion in order to get some sort of reward, right? So you spend resources because you're expecting that you will win a certain prize or you will gain a certain territories. And it's all in the perspective of management of resources. And this is how economics is all about. It's about the study of the people make and the choices that they make as they cope with the problem of scarce resources. So how do you use those scarce resources in order to maximize your utility, your payoff, your profit, so on and so forth. So very different perspectives, from these different disciplines. And that's what was so interesting about this issue, special issue, that it brought all of these minds together, talking about similarly the same context of war and conflict.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So going to economics, so you have another paper, War and Conflict in Economics, Theories, Applications, and Recent Trends. You say here theoretical treatments of conflict range from quite general models examining the trade-offs between conflict and production to more specific models examining optimal behavior in a variety of conflict institutions. These models vary in many details, but the implications are in many ways qualitatively consistent, you say, highlighting key commonalities across a variety of conflict settings. And so you have a few models here: contest models, war of attrition games, guns versus butter models, spatial conflict model. I find all of them very, very fascinating, Raman. So I have a background in economics, not deep background, but I started thinking about so how do they differ, and what are the commonalities among them?
Yeah. So when we talk about these different models, let's talk about first of all the commonalities. The commonalities are going to be, well, there is a fight for a prize, right? So there is some sort of prize. We can define it in a spatial model in the distance, trying to cover a bigger distance. In the war of attrition, it's kind of think of that as a pulling the rope. You want more of that rope. If it's in a contest model, it's a physical prize or monetary prize. So there is a prize, and the common finding is of course, as the level of the prize increases, there's more fighting. So it's a really interesting and fascinating finding, and it's a quite straightforward. I think nobody is gonna argue with that one. The more interesting nuanced one, but it's still a common more or less across these different different models, is that when you have a fight between an underdog and somebody who is let's say superstar in a way, there's actually quite interesting dynamic there. So the underdog usually gives up in the fight. We call it the discouragement effect. So the underdog in the fight, usually backs down, and the superstar doesn't have to fight as hard either, because they know that their dog is not going to fight as much. Now, there are some exceptions, to that rule. For example, there could be a case when their underdog is going to fight really hard, but most models will predict this discouragement effect. This is what we will call the common finding. There's also interesting basically application is the number of players gets bigger in a conflict. The conflicts actually most of the time the total intensity increases, of course, because you have more players. But individually, each player is going to be actually less engaged in the conflict, because their likelihood of winning this big conflict actually goes down because there are so many players. So there's these typical incentives that we as economists study, and and in terms of response to these incentives, we find that these different models have more or less similar predictions. Now, when we talk about the differences across them, the difference is going to be first in terms of application. The second one, the difference in terms of actually modeling. So what are we modeling? In a spatial context or in spatial contests, we're going to model, this fight for distance. The distance is really, you're trying to capture more territory, more market, depending what the specific model is. And the point is that it's harder for you to capture when you're more away from your base, right? Because it's further away, and it's easier to capture the territory that is closer to you. Then if you talk about guns versus butter, that's sort of the idea of trade, typical trade-off in economics, where if you're going to spend money all on guns, you're not going to have any butter. And so you need to balance it out. And what is the right equilibrium, given that the other countries also going to be deciding that trade-off for them as well. And so some countries going to spend more on guns, others more on butter, and those that have more guns will more likely to attack the countries that have more butter, and so on and so forth. And then there is international trade that comes into play there. So there is a really interesting models, and they all look at the conflict war contest from different perspectives.
Yeah, so I want to get back to Ukraine now in terms of what's happening there. All the human suffering, everybody can see it. As I said, I don't know much about this area. but it's an experiment, it's a laboratory in many ways. And so from an economic perspective, you can ask multiple questions. What is causing this war? So ultimately, as you say, there is a price. So there has to be some economic benefit that the aggressor is seeking here. So what do you think that is? Why do you think this war is happening?
So let's talk first of all what are the typical narratives that are put in
Yeah.
the media, because that's where it all starts, and
Yes.
then let's talk about the real motivations, as we look at this. So let me first of all talk about the narratives that are being put forth. So, for example, a typical story that the Russian propaganda will try to convince you is that it's a war. First of all, they were fighting Nazis, right, in Ukraine. Apparently, me and other people in Ukraine, we are called Nazis because we don't want to live under Russian occupation. Or there was another one that Ukraine was bombing, the eastern regions of Ukraine and all of that. There's another one that NATO expansion. It's because of the NATO, and Russia commonly blames. Basically, now that's their favorite narrative today because that's the one that they chose to focus in a recent month, and it's all the fault of NATO. If NATO didn't get involved, nothing would have happened. So these are the typical, narratives that happen. Now, why the war really happened? I mean, it's a historical context. It's a
Yeah.
really simple as that. Russia has been trying to conquer Ukraine for over 300 years. That's the history. We know about the genocide that was caused by Holodomor, which is a starvation of Ukrainian people. Millions of people died because of Stalin's regime. They really eradicated Ukrainians. They starved them to death. They were deporting people, and this is way before NATO, before all of the narratives that exist today, and it was already in the making. Russia was an empire, and it is still an empire that basically has a lot of people under their control, a lot of nationalities. And so basically, this mindset was never went away. So this is really the main motivation that, as I see, Russia still believes in that imperialistic worldview, that they are the empire. Putin, in his own admission, he said that the biggest mistake of the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. Basically saying, that's what he really believes. The biggest mistake, that's his own words. He repeated it many times. So basically,
Yeah.
they're trying to fix the history. They're trying to fix the history that they believe that went, wrong. The Russian Empire should have stayed together. And that's really where all the motivation comes from. It's as simple as that. It's an imperialistic ambition. And that is why it is so dangerous for the rest of the world, because if we go that far, well, how about we restore the British Empire? How about we
Yes. Yeah.
restore, a French Empire, or, Italian Empire? Let's go all the way to Roman Empire and go that direction. So we
Bit more
obviously,
difficult. Bit more difficult.
exactly. So this is, this is a real motivation behind it. That's now, of course, as an economist, I cannot help but also understand that, there's a lot of things that came in this war that played out as far as a behavioral kind of aspects. Now,
Yeah.
because I'm a behavioral economist, I cannot help but mention that and say that the reason why Putin even engaged in this war was because they had a very specific beliefs, and so let me just give you a couple of them. So one of the biases that we examine in behavioral economics is called overconfidence. So basically, a person's subjective confidence is greater
Yeah.
than the objective reality.
Yeah.
When I ask my MBA students how would they rate themselves relative to the other MBA students in the
Yes.
class,
They're all above average. Everybody's above
70%
average.
of them are above everybody else. I mean, it cannot be 70%. When we ask in the US how good of a driver you are, 90% of the drivers will say they're better than the average driver in the US.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
So, yeah, and if you think about this narrative of Russia being the second army of the world, they're going to take Kyiv in 2-3 days. Ukrainian government will run. Ukrainians will not fight, for Zelensky because they didn't appreciate the president that much. And I mean, I guess this last one is true in a way. Ukrainians are not fighting for Zelensky, and Zelensky is just he's an important player, but relatively, he is doing the bidding of the people, not the
Yeah.
other way around. So overconfidence was one of the reasons why Russia has made this step. Another one was the confirmation bias. Basically, Putin has surrounded himself only with the people
Who
that
say yes? Yeah.
said yes and
Yeah.
believed his narrative, right? He said, we're going to do this, and everybody, yeah, we're going to do this. So think about everybody who was in the opposition to Putin, like Prigozhin, like Herkin. I mean, Prigozhin is already dead, presumably dead. Herkin is in the prison, and anybody who would say anything against the narrative that self-confirms the biases that they already had is going to be out of the picture. So,
Yeah.
and there's other things that play into this war. Why, from the cognitive perspective, what motivated Putin and the Russian regime to uh, get engaged in this war and now continuing. Like, imagine there's another bias called sunk cost fallacy. Once you start investing in the resources or spending time and money on a specific thing, and what happens is that you, even if it's going to be unprofitable and bad to you, you're still going to engage in that behavior in order to recover those losses. Even though they already sunk, they're gone. You're not going to recover them ever, but
Yeah.
you're still going to make it worthwhile, right? We've lost Russian, are talking about, we lost so many troops, we lost, half of our tanks. We need to make it worth it, right? Worthwhile for us to have started in the first place. So this is all of these narratives. They play out in this cycle, viral cycle of continual conflict and war. So that's basically on a psychological level why it's happening what is happening.
So let me see if I can sort of understand this, Roman. So there is imperial ambitions. USSR is gone, but maybe Putin doesn't buy that. There's Russia. The original USSR has lost a lot of its territories, and Ukraine was part of that USSR regime. So that's that motivation. Let's get back and become big motivation. There is also, if I understand this correctly, so the overconfidence you talked about. So when he went into Georgia, when the world was sort of distracted by other wars, things sort of happened as he expected in
Right.
some ways.
Exactly.
And so he's using the same template, it looks like, in Ukraine,
Yes,
right?
that's correct.
So that's part of the overconfidence part. But there is a significant economic question here. So Crimea and areas around it has lot of resources. And I understand. So there's a sort of a resource question here. There's hydrocarbons that you want to get hold of. And I understand that Crimea has a water problem because after the annexation, Ukraine decided not to send them any water through a singular river that they have access to. So
Yeah,
yeah,
let's start unpacking these things so we can talk
yeah,
more about this.
yeah,
So let me just go from the very end. So Ukraine didn't close the rivers to Crimea, but they could have done it. And obviously, once Russia is engaged in a full scale war,
yeah,
Ukraine would have stopped that. So
Right.
basically, but since 2014, Crimea did have access to water, and Ukraine, because one of the premises is that Ukraine is operating that Crimea is Ukraine, and so they don't want for the Ukrainian people who are still in Crimea to
Suffer.
suffer,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
and so they actually didn't stop the water there then, but now maybe they would consider because of the Russian full-scale invasion. But let's now go back to this other idea, is that the resources are there, and that's why Russia, for Russia it is a lucrative possibility. Now, look, Russia is the biggest country in the world. They literally have virtually unlimited resources. They have everything that Ukraine has times X. So really, the resources in Donbass are not. It cannot be the main reason why Russia is,
Hmm.
wants the territory. It's just it's very minimal relatively to what the real motivation would be. Now, I'm not saying it's.
Even with the new findings in the Black Sea.
So the Black Sea is a bit different, and the reason is the Crimea Peninsula really gives a strategic base for the naval and the Black Sea operations. So because of that, for Russia, the Black Sea is the Crimea Peninsula is sort of the most important kind of defense from the Western Europe, because it's
Yeah.
far enough and close enough. It's accessible by the sea, so you cannot really fully stop the access to that peninsula. So the point is that is a strategic post. So I can buy in, but Russia already had Crimea in 2014,
Right.
so they have occupied, and it was there. So I don't really think that it was so important for them, because they already had it. But now we go to the very beginning when you'd mentioned Georgia, and we can go also to Moldova, we can go also to the Azerbaijan versus Abkhazia, all of that. And so what you will find is that Russia has constantly used the same narrative, the same scenario. I actually study, I use this example to teach my students in the game theory course of, the behavior of Russia. And I explained that the step that Putin made let's say in Georgia was very rational. Now, why I'm saying that? Because he'd done this before, and he never was penalized for that. Right?
Yeah.
He would annex, he would take part of Moldova, he would create in other areas, he would create calamity, and there was never a pushback. Then he went for Georgia. Again, there was not significant pushback. He went
Yeah.
for Ukraine, for annexing Crimea. And again, for
Yeah.
example, in that case, Obama didn't even bother to put any sanctions in place or help Ukraine in any way. So
Obama had a red line, and Putin crossed that red line, and they said, "Oh, the red
ex-
line is gone." Yeah.
exactly. So he basically, based on these previous observances, he kind of deducted for himself, well, this is how it's always going to be. And this is precisely why we need to really draw a hard red line right now and help Ukraine with everything that we can. And we can do way more, because if we don't stop this today, when does it going to end? We need to punish Russia for this kind of behavior. This will also prevent any further potential wars in the future, because if China, God forbid, decided to invade Taiwan, they know that what's going to come for them is the same story that what happened with Russia, meaning that everybody is going to be behind Taiwan, they're going to support them, and even engage physically with China. So China will know, well, we cannot invade Taiwan because we don't want to have the same fate that Russia has.
Yeah. So, I mean, war is such an antiquated concept that I would imagine the younger kids today would find it really difficult to understand. You don't go into another country, you don't kill people, you don't kill school children.
Yeah,
I mean, these are stuff that we thought we left behind,
yeah,
but it's happening now.
right.
And so from a policy perspective, I mean, this is quite interesting, right? Um, so there are a lot of countries helping Ukraine with hardware and other support. And there's a larger question in terms of exit, right? So when do you so what do you think? So knowing Putin's ambitions of making USSR happen again, which is in a smaller way at least, um, when do you think he will realize that may not happen? And how do you think the war could end?
Yeah, so this is a tough question. This is a very tough question, obviously, that is very real to Ukrainians on a daily basis. And now, one thing that I can tell you is that, and then this is not has nothing to do with President Zelensky, has nothing to do with the Ukrainian government. Anything you mention, corruption, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. What matters is that there is Ukrainian people, and all of these people, they don't want to give away an inch of their land because it is their land, it is their freedom. It's like, if there was a robber that came into your house and said, "Hey, I'm going to live in one of your rooms," and you'll say, "Oh yeah, okay, that room can be yours." No, you will never do that. And because you have such an attachment to your house. Now imagine how much more attachment you have to your land, your territory, where you grew up. That's, you call it your homeland. So Ukrainians will never basically back from that. This is Crimea will never be Russian. The next territories as of now will never be Russian. Now, so what could happen, and this is a potential way to have some sort of ceasefire, is that when Ukraine is going to say, "Well, we're not never going to recognize this territory as Russian," the international law, international countries will never recognize this as Russian. There could be a diplomatic way to resolve this, and until the sanctions are not, until these territories don't become officially Ukrainian, the sanctions are going to be in place to punish Russia for holding these territories. But there is no killing, there's sort of ceasefire. And I think it's going to be a tough sell for Ukrainians who don't want to stop fighting until they recover the territories.
Mm.
But, I think it's a political step that Zelensky and his team and whoever is going to be running the country may consider taking in order to preserve Ukrainian lives and sort of stop the war. Again, the sanctions are going to stay with Russia until they are occupying these territories, but there may not be as intense fighting anymore. So this is one scenario that I see as plausible.
Yeah.
Ukraine could also, there could be another scenario where Russia basically backs up and there is some concessions made on the precondition that Ukraine is not going to join NATO and any other alliances, which is, was never really, you have to understand that
It's not
this,
enforceable. It's not really
yeah,
enforceable.
so first of all, it's not enforceable, but Ukrainians never wanted in the first place to be a part of NATO. So if you go into late 1990s and you look at the surveys of people asked, if you want to join NATO, and so about 20% of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. There was no point of joining NATO. We wanted to be, even the constitution of Ukraine was written in such a way that the country was not part of any bloc, any sort of alliance. And when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, that percentage jumped to 50%. I mean, there were different polls, but more or less 50% of people wanted to join NATO. Now it's almost 90%. Almost 90% of people want to join NATO in Ukraine precisely because it's a response to the Russian aggression, not the vice versa. Russia is always trying to say, "Oh, NATO is coming," so it's no. Russia is coming, and therefore NATO will be as a response to that.
right.
So this is in terms of these kind of scenarios that could unfold. And of course, another one that Putin dies and there is some sort of significant reshuffling that happens in Russia. And but I do not. I don't think that Putin. I mean, this is where I would actually have a lot of debates, even with Ukrainians and other people. But I don't believe that Putin is the problem. He is, as I've said it many times,
He's a
he's
symptom. He's a
a
symptom of a
symptom of
regime.
a
Yeah,
much bigger
yeah,
sickness, you know. And
yeah.
so, if Putin is not there, we can get even somebody much worse than him, you know. So this is why I'm a strong proponent for really giving Ukraine everything they need to stop Russia right now and not and make them pay such a price that they will never ever consider doing anything that's stupid, because we've done this mistake before. We've made this mistake before with Nazi Germany. We when Britain tried to say, oh, you know what, Poland you can take, but don't take more, or some other countries. And so this was a really a problem that we have faced before. We know that aggression and terrorism cannot be negotiated with. And so
So let me
this
ask
is,
you,
yeah.
sorry, Roman. So let me ask you sort of a United Nations context. So we have 200 countries in the world. I don't know the exact numbers, but I think 180, 185 of them condemned the invasion. It is by international law, you couldn't do this. So, condemnation is automatic in most cases. But we have 15 countries or so, I don't know the exact numbers, who either stood on the sidelines or actively supported the invasion.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, these are large countries. Some of them are autocratic, some of them are apparently democratic. Um, they're large countries, and they house almost half the world's population. And so I don't know if United Nations has the power anymore to enforce international laws. I mean, if Putin travels to 150 countries in the world, he's going to get arrested. Other 50, not really. So he can pick his countries where he wants to travel to have a vacation. So there is no unified international law. There is no unified enforcement of international law. And so is United Nations is really relevant anymore?
Yeah, so this is a very painful subject for me as far as the United Nations goes. I just opened up the votes here. So when we were talking about the annexation of Ukrainian territory, it's actually only found in condemning Russia. So basically, only 5 countries voted no. So 144 voted yes. There are some abstentions, strategic ones, but the countries that voted no is Russia, Belarus, which is basically, as
A puppet,
Russia
a
number two,
puppet
right?
regime. Yeah.
Dictatorship, North Korea, Syria, and Nicaragua. So these are not democracies, none of them. And they are not only democracies, but they are authoritarian regimes that are already eyeing other countries and, are very problematic in themselves.
But
So,
abstentions are also interesting, right? Abstention basically means that you are not willing to stand behind a
right.
set of principles,
So
right?
you
Yeah,
still want to do business with Russia. That's what abstention means.
right.
Basically, if you condemning Russia, then why should you be doing business with Russia? But Russia is, as I said, one of the most resourceful countries in the world, and so countries like India and China have benefited tremendously from isolation, from Russia's isolation from Europe and the United States, because the trades with India and China went through the roof, since then with Russia. So there are countries that are benefiting then, and that's why not condemning Russia is, is a kind of democratic. I don't know if it's democratic, but it's a way to still do business as usual. Now, that being said, let's go back to the United Nations. I completely agree with you. It became a useless organization, unfortunately. The fact that we have Russia that has done this genocidal aggression that is, historic in its context, and still sitting on the UN Council, basically that's the decisive power. It's like, having Nazi Germany being on the UN Council. Why
On the
not,
Security Council, yeah.
Exactly, on the Security Council, and that's just ridiculous. It just points out to. I understand that some diplomats make an argument that's the only available means of communication with these countries still, right? North Korea. I mean, we don't have diplomatic any relationship with North Korea, but at the UN there is, representation, and there could be some communication happening there. Now, as I said, I think that it's actually very impotent. It really lost its credibility. The UN, it lost its power. It's this organization, and it's very unfair also to the African countries. If you go to the UN representation, the UN Council representation, some of the biggest countries are not there. And I think historically it's been unfair to the African countries, which is also known. But the point is that with this conflict and this war has just clearly demonstrated that, something needs to change. Needs to change in UN, needs to change, in the world security network.
Yeah. So the larger question then is, I mean, economics, you and I understand, there's a profit maximizing motive, whether it's a company or a country. But there are set of laws, set of rules, international laws that you have to adhere to. So suppose I find lithium in Belarus, I cannot just go get the lithium. I mean, this is why it put these rules into place, right? So, and when you do stuff like that, there has to be repercussions to it.
Yeah.
The whole international community has to come. So, Security Council, as you say, is very lopsided. I mean, um, the number of nuclear bombs you have is not sufficiently robust metric to say you get automatic admission Security Council.
Well, the interesting thing, it's a historical context as well. Russia was never voted as a part of UN. It's United Nations because Ukraine actually formally requested, and it was admitted to UN after the fall of the Soviet Union. There was a USSR, which is and Russia kind of felt that their grandfather into UN as a result of the fall of the USSR, because basically admitting that they are the empire that gave birth, and basically we should be continuing, but legally, they never, after the fall of USSR is a part of the UN, but not Russia, because all the other countries, they sort of made the application, but Russia is technically, legally, is actually shouldn't be a part of UN, which is an interesting case in itself. But anyway.
Right. So where do we go from here, Roman? So, from an economic perspective, so it looks like, if I understand you correctly, you are saying the primary motivation here is sort of making Russia bigger. Going back the USSR days. So
it is. Let's talk about the bigger is a good word to use it, but bigger in more than the territory sense, right? So the bigger in terms of the empire, right? So the empire, it's the ambition. Putin is writing his name in the history. He is expanding the territories of Russia. The Russia is now the global threat again, as it was during the Cold War, and And so in that sense, that's what I agree. I don't think that bigger in terms of getting a smaller piece of Ukraine as anything adding additional value to Russia as a whole country. It's the biggest country in the world already. I mean, what else do you need?
Yeah. Yeah, so if that is the real incentive, real motivation behind the war, how do you think it could end? I mean, what are our choices to end this war?
Well, as I said before, the scenario that I see is that Russia gets punished to a
Yeah,
sufficient level that they basically understand that they will lose this war. I mean, they Ukrainians know Ukrainians cannot lose the war because it's their territory, and anybody who believes otherwise is just doesn't know the history. I mean, think about any country trying to invade another country. Let's say U.S. trying to do its war in Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan is not Ukraine. Ukraine is a much more powerful country, and U.S. is not Russia. U.S. is much more powerful country, and yet U.S. couldn't do it. They tried for years and years, and they had to withdraw. Now imagine now we have Ukraine fighting Russia, and there is a lot of resources behind Ukraine as well from other countries. So there's just they have no chance of winning this war. No chance, literally no chance. And we can go and look at other examples. And so the only way that they will really sort of end, and the sooner it's the better, is when they really realize that just really there's no chance for us to do this. We lost almost all of our army. We cannot replenish our tanks. We cannot replenish our rockets as fast. We are becoming a laughing stock for the rest of the world because we were supposed to take Kyiv in 3 days and now it's already 6 years. So if the war were to continue, into the future, obviously that will be more and more difficult for Russia to sell as like, oh, we are winning the war. It's just ridiculous. And it's already becoming ridiculous at this stage. So this is why the support of the Western countries is so essential
yeah,
for quicker ending this war. Because if the Western countries are not going to support Ukraine, Ukrainians are still going to fight. They're still going to fight on their own, but it's obviously it's not going to happen. But still, I'm just pointing out. So the more we inflict damage on Russia, the faster this war is going to end. Hopefully, Putin is going to be repelled by his own people and his own, propaganda that will say, well, you promised us this and we have nothing, So that's my hope, and my hope it's gonna end sooner than later.
yeah. So I know that you have to go. So as you mentioned, there's some strategic advantages here. As a Chinese autocrat sitting there salivating over Taiwan,
Right.
how the world responds to an aggressor that is against international law has a foundational effect on all countries. It's not just China. There are other, even supposedly democratic countries looking to annex small countries around it. Annexation is not allowed in international
Right.
law. So the world has to respond to it in real terms, and Ukraine has to win this war, I would say, not for just this war, to sort of make the point that international law will stay. Yeah.
Absolutely. So let me just give a final kind of word
Yeah.
explaining why this war is so important and why standing with Ukraine is just, I mean, it's the only reasonable choice that we have as a world society. First of all, it's the right moral thing to do. I mean, you would not be standing on the Nazi side, in 1940s. You wouldn't say, "Oh, I mean, this is the same story that repeats itself." It's the fight for freedom. Anybody who stands for freedom, and especially in the United States, if we're talking about, America, we are the country of liberty and freedom. So if you stand for freedom, that's why you should be fighting for Ukraine and helping Ukraine, standing against tyranny and dictatorship. If you are against those things, this is why you should support Ukraine. If preventing any sort of future terrorism, we are obviously want to punish any acts of terrorism. Now, why I say terrorism? Well, because it's when you kill innocent civilians, destroy their livelihood. The winter is coming, and during the winter, what Russians will most likely do, they'll continue bombing the electric grids for people. So they're really making the miserable life for people, which is what terrorists do. There's no military target there. It's just, terrorism. So if you stand for the international law, if you believe in sort of agreements that are been made in the past, like Budapest Memorandum, that we promised security guarantees to Ukraine, in Budapest Memorandum, and now we are sort of, Ukraine should deal with its own problems. In terms of strengthening NATO, I mean, NATO today is the strongest as it ever been because of this Russian aggression. Now NATO is actually countries, in the US, we were pushing NATO to move that direction, to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, and it was very difficult to do. Today, NATO, they all understand that that's the only way to secure peace in the world. In terms of return on investment, when you at the expense of some percentages points of the defense budget, the United States has, basically taken down half of the army of one of their major adversaries in the world and the threat to the global peace. Yeah. In terms of, who you mentioned this, on the geopolitical benefit, other countries are watching, like Taiwan and others. And if you want to create this world security, that is the only way for us. And so if you are rationally thinking, moral person, I mean, the choice should be very obvious.
It's now, also game theory.
It's a game theory as well. And you just need to ignore the Russian propaganda and the narratives that have been put up as a false narratives. And just at that time, things become very obvious for me. They've been very obvious from the day one. And I appreciate and thank everyone, including you, who have been standing with Ukraine and helping us out. And I hope that I'll get back to studying the war and conflict in more peaceful time.
Excellent, Roman. Thanks so much for taking part in this.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.